Russia Tomorrow.
Herr Dr. Heusgen, vielen herzlichen Dank.
Mr. Heusgen, thank you very much for answering TV Rain's questions.
Thank you as well. Glad to have this opportunity to talk to you.
Eine anschauliche Nachricht.
There was some revealing news coming from Germany in recent days. On the first anniversary of the outbreak of war, the German Ministry of Defense proudly announced that instead of the originally promised 14 Leopard tanks, 18 tanks will be sent to Ukraine in March. If I'm not mistaken, it took your country more than 2 months of fierce wrangling to achieve this result. In Berlin, do they really think that with this rate of arms deliveries from Western allies, primarily Germany, Ukraine will be able to win this war?
You have to understand how and from where we got to this point. It has always been in Germany's tradition to refuse to supply any weapons to conflict-ridden regions, and this has been the case until recently. Even on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, German politicians repeatedly said, "We will not supply Kiev with weapons." But with his attack on Ukraine, Vladimir Putin shattered the old world order, and now Germany is supporting Ukraine, which includes the provision of weapons. But that is exactly why we have had to work hard to come to concrete solutions in recent months, and that's why it all drags on very slowly. It would personally make me very happy if we had started supplying tanks to the Ukrainians back in the fall. But yes, so far we are acting rather indecisively. I'm sorry it's taking so long.
You say that things are changing, but what if you look at, for example, the recent protests? Tens of thousands of Germans are taken to the streets, demanding peace at any price and an end to arms deliveries to Ukraine. After all, right next to us on Berlin's main street, protesters covered a Russian tank paced by Ukraine with roses as a symbol of their disagreement with military support for Kiev. Do you think Berlin will be able to continue with a policy resisted by a large proportion of its population for extended length of time?
Well, that's a symptom of democracy. Here are the people, and they're taking to the streets to protest the policies being pursued. But if you look closely at these rallies, if you listen to the arguments of these demonstrators, you can see how full of misconceptions they are. These people are still dreaming about some kind of negotiations with Russia, saying that if we take into account their interests, if we start communicating with them, we would be able to reach some result. It's an illusion. We need politicians, journalists, NGOs who can convey to these people the two sides are needed for negotiation. It must be that both those who have been attacked and those who have attacked are ready for negotiation. That second side must also be ready to admit, we made mistakes, we should not have invaded, we want to retreat, and from now on, act on the basis of international law. We hear nothing of this kind from Vladimir Putin.
Das ist völlig nachvollziehbar. Sie reden von Illusionen.
That's very clear. You talk about illusions, but is it an illusion when German polls tell us that only 1 in 4 Germans supports further arms supplies to Ukraine? Is there a threat that the mood will change not only in society, but in the government too?
Natürlich besteht die Gefahr, es ist eine gewisse Müdigkeit, man sieht...
Of course there is such a threat, as there is indeed a certain fatigue from the war. People can see the cost of it. People are feeling the effects of the crisis caused by Russia's attack. Electricity prices are going up. A real struggle is happening to redraw the country's budget. Of course, none of this is easy, and it requires real political leadership. We have to get the message out again and again that not only is Ukraine's freedom at stake, but our freedom as well.
And on the other side of the front, we see a cornered, disoriented man at the head of a huge authoritarian state with a divided population. A state easily militarized and mobilized. Who do you think will show more strength in this conflict? Europe, which is unlikely to face existential consequences from Ukraine's defeat? Or Putin, for whom his political and physical life is literally at stake?
I guess Putin firmly believes that his patience will last longer than ours. He thinks that we are, and he keeps saying it over and over again, a decadent society, incapable of facing such challenges.
Putin generally considered most of Europe's governments to be weaklings. My American colleague Thomas Donilon, Obama's security advisor, told me about his conversation with Putin in 2012. Putin complained to him about the low level of economic cooperation with the US. It apparently corresponded to the volume of trade, quote, with those from Holland. Donilon was shocked by these remarks, but they obviously explained a lot about Putin himself. His desire to speak to Americans as equals, his contempt for Europeans, and his ideas about people.
Setzt auf eine Ukraine-Müdigkeit in.
His calculation is that Europe will get tired of Ukraine, that we will get tired of supporting it, that in the long run he will break the resistance within Ukraine itself. But I think he's wrong. First and foremost, he's wrong about Ukrainians. With his own actions, Putin created an incredibly strong Ukrainian identity. And now it even includes the Russian-speaking population that Putin was so fond of talking about protecting. As for us, I think Putin is mistaken here too. I believe that the persistence, the will of Europeans is stronger than Putin expects. Yes, it is more complicated here than in Russia, where people follow the ideology that has been drummed into their heads. In a democracy in general, everything is more complicated. But I believe that with the right political leadership, we will be able to support Ukraine for a long time. And you know, for all of Putin's authority inside Russia, the rumors that are making their way over here are more and more arguments between Shoigu and Prigozhin, a lot of backstabbing that's bound to go on. I don't believe that Vladimir Putin will survive in the long run. When he sends thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers to their deaths, at some point, any society will say, enough.
All these months, the Kremlin has been spreading the story that the war could have been avoided if the West had shown more respect to and more trust in Moscow. And here are statements from both your former boss Chancellor Merkel and former French President Hollande, both in December, referring to the Minsk Agreements, acknowledging that their purpose then was to give Kiev time. For his part, Putin publicly declared these statements as another sign of mistrust and disrespect.
Оказывается, они тоже нас обманывали, и это смысл заключался только в том, чтобы накачать Украину оружием и подготовить к боевым действиям.
Which means that the war itself was an even more justified decision.
Может быть, и раньше все это надо было начинать, но просто мы рассчитывали на то, что все-таки сможем договориться в рамках этих мирных соглашений.
You were there in 2015 in Minsk. Were these agreements really signed just to give the Ukrainians time?
Well, I haven't heard such statements from our former Chancellor, and I haven't talked to her about it. But as her foreign policy advisor, I myself led the Minsk negotiations, and then, up until 2017, was responsible for the implementation of Minsk II. And I can tell you that when this agreement was being worked out, we believed that thanks to it, we would follow a peaceful diplomatic path. Look at the Minsk Agreements themselves. They included all the possibilities for a peaceful result. The problem is that Russia did not fulfill them. If you look at the very first paragraph of the Minsk Agreements, it said that 60 hours after the signing, there was supposed to be a ceasefire. Did that happen? It did not happen. Because at that point, Vladimir Putin and his army was not as strong as he thought, so he had to fight for 3 more days to capture Debaltseve. Thus, the first point was not fulfilled immediately. The second point was the withdrawal of heavy weapons, but Putin never allowed their withdrawal from the line of contact.
In your book, you write about how Putin, when you personally laid it all out for him, called you a scoundrel.
Because I pointed out to him what was contained in the Minsk Agreements and what he had not implemented.
But aren't you oversimplifying? Weren't there also, from Kiev's point of view, things in that agreement that were knowingly impossible to implement? Like, how could such a state as complex as Ukraine decide on real federalization? Wouldn't that mean the collapse of the entire Ukrainian system?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Or here's the point about elections in Donbas. Even though there were no Ukrainian politicians in Donbas anymore, Angela Merkel, who you were next to, didn't she already understand then that this was completely utopian thing?
Schauen Sie sich das doch an, dieses Abkommen, das hat im Hinblick auf.
Look at this agreement. Here, for example, the federalization and autonomy provided would be comparable to the autonomy that areas in Germany have, for example. In actual fact, the Ukrainians ended up federalizing somewhat. You mentioned the point about holding elections in Donbass. Conducting them normally would indeed be difficult, and it would require a long effort to reach a unified solution. We had a discussion about it. But on the other hand, we did manage at that time to ensure, for example, the presence of OSCE representatives in Donbass. So we cannot completely rule out that the Minsk Agreement could still be implemented. But I also want to tell you this. For years, I've been negotiating the implementation of the Minsk Agreements. I talked to people like Surkov, and when negotiating with him, every time I noticed that there was no political will to put these agreements into practice.
Это закон Украины о том, что на Донбасс не распространяются законы Украины. Это главное в этих соглашениях. Это так называемый, то, что я называю символическим суверенитетом над Донбассом.
And since before that Surkov was the man in charge of working with Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, I increasingly thought that he wanted to eventually make something like Transnistria and Abkhazia from Donetsk as well.
Another frozen conflict.
Indeed, a frozen conflict. So it fit into the overall logic where you just cut off part of Ukraine and then let a small conflict continue there, which in turn prevented Kiev from focusing on reforms or joining the EU or NATO without difficulty.
Принуждение силой к братским отношениям – это единственный метод, доказавший эффективность на украинском направлении.
Так и есть.
То есть вы по-прежнему?
Абсолютно.
Hätte Kiew in den nächsten 8 Jahren
If Kiev had implemented its part of the Minsk Agreements over the next 8 years, despite all of Moscow's plotting, would not the war have been prevented then?
verhindert worden?
Das ist eine theoretische Frage. Ich glaube, dass
That's a theoretical question. I think that Poroshenko really tried everything, including trying to implement the Minsk Agreements. But I personally went to the Verkhovna Rada. I talked to the deputies. They explained to me, you demand that we adopt amendments to the constitution, change the status of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and conduct federalization. Are we supposed to do our homework while watching Putin do nothing? He doesn't agree to a trade. He doesn't withdraw heavy weapons from the line of contact. He doesn't allow observers in. So why should we do our share of the work? Yes, and even if in the end, let's imagine that the Minsk Agreements were implemented by Kiev and a federalized but freely developing country emerged, it would only mean that another successful European state emerged, and that would not be in Russia's interests.
In Minsk and at the subsequent talks at the Normandy format, what was your impression? Did your interlocutors, Putin, Lavrov, Surkov, truly believe in these ideas of a Russian world, of Novorossiya?
Vladimir Putin.
It seems to me that this impression of Vladimir Putin as a Tsar driven by some kind of ideology serves to greatly overrate him. I don't think he's that. Putin is simply a creature of chance, formed as he is. He's a man of the simplest origins, an officer of the security service who always remained loyal to them and hated the democratic changes that had taken place in his country. Only later did he outright adopt nationalism. He exploited the memory of the Great Patriotic War, assuring his fellow citizens that it is Russia that is under attack, not the one attacking. Putin is a manipulator, exploiting his own country's ideology and history.
Diese Manipulationen, dieser Opportunismus, waren sie auch...
In your direct interaction with Putin and his entourage, was this opportunism also noticeable? You write in your book about how at the talks in Minsk, one of your employees, who spoke Russian, happened to be in the room where there was a Russian delegation that Lavrov was a part of.
Welche Reaktion Lavrov und Co. Das russische Staatsfernsehen sich anschauen.
Together, they were watching the news on Russian television and doubling over with laughter as they listened to the obvious lies the host was delivering to the public.
Ja, das war natürlich, ich kenne Lavrov seit vielen Jahren. Lavrov ist ein Zyniker.
Yes, and this is typical Lavrov. I've known him for many years. Lavrov is a cynic, the biggest cynic imaginable. All of them, and their great ideologue Surkov, were having fun seeing how successfully this so-called ideology of theirs works in action. Neither international treaties nor human lives play any role for them. They perceive everything as a political game. And the indescribable propaganda that Lavrov is spreading now, which, by the way, is why I refused to invite him to the Munich Security Conference this year. Well, this propaganda doesn't fit the image of Lavrov from back in '94, when, as Russia's representative to the UN, he also insisted that the Budapest Memorandum, which gave Ukraine security guarantees, be considered at the UN Security Council.
В международном праве ясно записано, что сила может применяться только в двух случаях. В случаях самообороны при вооруженном нападении на какую-то страну, и второй случай – это когда Совет Безопасности уполномочивает.
Sieht alles, wie gesagt,
It's a man without principles. It's all cynicism and behavior depending on the situation.
verpflichtet.
There's a very widespread opinion today that the West, including Berlin, contributed to this war by pursuing a policy of appeasement toward Putin. They say that they should have reacted much earlier after Georgia and 2008, or that much harsher and more consistent measures should have been taken already in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea and the First Donbas War. As the Chancellor's foreign policy advisor, you were shaping it then. How do you feel about that criticism now?
Ja, also man ist natürlich im Nachhinein immer klüger.
Of course, in hindsight, we're all smarter. As for Germany, I think you have to understand our roots. The roots of a state that is responsible for more than 20 million deaths in the former USSR, to which we now owe a great debt, with a great many of them, incidentally, in what is now Ukraine.
Der ehemaligen Sowjetunion.
But how does that apply
Das hat
to
mit
Putin?
Es hat mit Russland zu tun, weil Putin ist der
It
Präsident.
doesn't refer to Putin but to Russia, which Putin is the president of. Many Germans continue to feel a sense of guilt and a certain gratitude towards Russia since World War II. We were grateful to, let's be honest, a weakened Russia, Gorbachev's Russia, which Putin obviously despised so much, for the reunification of Germany.
Verachtet hat.
Und das billige Gas ist vonnöten, ist klar. Mir fallen
I'm reminded of, I'll phrase this as a Philistine, two images. One was the G20 summit in Brisbane in 2014, when few people wanted to shake Putin's hand. And the second is just 4 years later, when in 2018, Russian state channels are happy to show Putin being triumphantly received by Angela Merkel at her residence in Merseburg. So the viewer might think, how is that possible?
Ich war 2018.
By 2018, I was no longer an advisor to Chancellor Merkel, so I can't say for sure. Even in 2016, we hosted Vladimir Putin here in Berlin as part of the Normandy format meeting. But there was no celebratory mood there. It was a very, very chilly atmosphere.
obgleich die russischen Medien...
The Russian media, of course, used this footage to show, look, we are not isolated at all. Here's Mrs. Merkel making connections with Putin like the old days.
Putin führt.
Also 2016 war es eben ein Treffen im Rahmen des Normandie-Formats.
Yes, it was a meeting in the Normandy format, the same one that was held in Paris. And I believe that these attempts were quite legitimate until the invasion of 2022. There was, after all, the feeling that we were obliged to try to find common ground with Putin. This is what the French president, Hollande's successor Macron, was also striving for. He invited Putin to the castle, and he tried to get through to Putin somehow. You know, today we're talking about doing everything we can to defeat Putin, to support Ukraine, so that Putin can't achieve any success. And the argument that we've really tried everything before plays a big part in this tough stance.
Mr. Heusgen, thank you for talking.
Thank you for your insight, and all the best.
TV Rain has started broadcasting in English so that you could get news about Russia, the war in Ukraine, and Russian society directly from the source.
Russia's military is unable to stop Ukrainian forces.
The Kremlin's newest propaganda target is now the LGBT community.
TV Rain channel has been shut down in Russia many times. The last one happened at the beginning of March, when the war started.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We survived, started working from Europe, and now we are watched by millions of people every day, for whom we are the only TV station that tells the truth about the war. Subscribe to our English channel TV Rain Newsroom on YouTube.